This is going to be a look at working with Lightroom files in Photoshop, starting out in Lightroom, preparing the file, and then moving it to Photoshop for some finishing touches using filters. So to start with, I have a photo here, and I've taken it through the Lightroom Develop module, cropping, tone work, exposure, everything that I would want to do in Lightroom to get it ready. And at this point, I'm ready to take it into Photoshop. Now there are several ways to get the photo into Photoshop, whether I'm in Develop, Library, or any of the other modules. I can right-click on the file, Edit In, or I can go up to Photo, Edit In. Now I have two options, Edit in Adobe Photoshop, and I have CS6 here. It may be a different version of Photoshop. Whatever is currently installed will show up. Or open as a Smart Object. Now these do different things. Generally, I prefer to open the photos as smart objects because I have more flexibility with them. I can do more things to them. I can take them back into the camera raw interface, which is the same controls that are in Lightroom, if I need to make further adjustments or tweaks. And I get more options with Photoshop filters. So it's generally just a better thing to have. The drawbacks are larger file sizes and slower file saves. I'm going to click Open as Smart Object and get started. Now, to tell that I have a Smart Object, I check the Layers palette on the right, and I get this little icon, and that tells me that the layer itself, is a Smart Object. If I double-click on that layer, the photo opens in the camera raw interface, and I have all the adjustments that I would have in Lightroom. The layout is a little bit different, but everything else is the same. Tool options across the top here. So if I decide later on I need to increase the exposure, I can do that. I cancel that, but if I did make any change and click OK, it would update this version here. Now, the file does not get updated in Lightroom. Say I do an exposure increase, it will update on the Photoshop file that's currently open, but the other file in Lightroom, the original file, does not get updated. While I'm in Photoshop, I can play with adjustment layers if I need to, and these do similar things as what you find in Lightroom, and they do some different things. Curves layer, we've used curves in Lightroom before. You've got hue and saturation, color balance, different filters that you can use, different adjustment layers, I should say, to edit the image, brightness, colors, what have you. So I can add a simple S-curve to this image and apply it to this layer. I'm going to delete that adjustment layer for now and close that palette. Now I'm going to apply a filter, and since I'm in 16-bit mode, some filters are not available. So to make sure I get the full selection of filters, I'm going to switch this to 8-bit mode. In Photoshop CS5, you get fewer filters available in 16-bit, but you get a bit more in CS6. So if I apply a simple Gaussian blur, and I'll set a 10 pixel radius just for fun, doesn't really matter, the blur shows up under the layer as a smart filter. I can hide it, show it, I can double click on it and change my blur settings as many times as I want, and that's the advantage of having smart filters. You can't do smart filters unless the layer is a smart object. So I'm going to drag this to the trash for now. And it's an important point to note that switching to 8-bit mode, it lends some weaknesses to the file. If I do massive adjustments in my adjustment layers, levels, changes, curves, that kind of thing, I can get visual artifacting because 8-bit color space is not as refined as 16-bit. There's simply less data to work with. So my tonal gradations, for example in the sky here, if I do a massive curve change, they might show up as a stair-step pattern where you see the change in tonality. A 16-bit file would be less likely to show that. So for this exercise, what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer and then add a filter to the duplicate, and then play around with the blending modes and the opacity to give a sort of an artistic effect. Whether or not it's truly artistic is left to the viewer. But this is something that we can do in Photoshop that's not possible at this time anyway in Lightroom, and it may be in the future. So to duplicate the layer, I have a couple steps to do that, different ways to do it. I can right-click on the layer and select Duplicate, and I'll call this Filter, so I know what I'm looking at. I can also hold the Option or the Alt key and drag the layer up, and it will create a copy that way. I'll drag that other one into the trash, don't need that. Now just with these two duplicate layers, changing the blending mode will do different things to the file. And all of these blending modes are simply mathematical operations being applied to each pixel. If the pixel is a certain color, darken it or lighten it or do something else to it. Now, of course, it's just about impossible to remember which blending mode does what. So I'm often finding myself stepping through. I don't use these often enough to say, oh yes, lighter color is exactly what I want this time. There are some cheat sheets available on the internet. Some people have gone through and shown various examples of duplicating an image like this, or doing a color overlay or a textural overlay, and seeing what each mode does. I'll go back to normal here, and I'll apply a filter. Now Photoshop has a number of artistic filters, and they're in various places in the filter drop-down menu. Try mosaic, and that's a different one. Let me see if I can find what I'm looking for here. Not that. Let's see, I believe CS6 goes to filter gallery. CS5, the filter gallery is accessed slightly differently. I'm going to cancel this. Filter gallery in CS6, but in CS5 it's found in various places in these menus, sub-menus here. But once we're in the filter gallery, we can take a look and see what's going on. And choose a filter. For example, stained glass. This is kind of a fun one. You have quite a few different filters built in. And edge detect. And depending on the filter, it'll take less time or more time to render. But you can get some fairly interesting results. I'm going to play with the stained glass filter. And I have different views on this side here. The color of the glass outline is dependent on your color in Photoshop. Cancel that, and then whatever I choose here will end up in that filter. Choosing a red gives me red outlines. Just something to keep in mind. I'm going to click on the default setting for colors and then bring the filter gallery back up. So now I'm ready to take a closer look at this stained glass filter. I'll fit in view just to see overall what I'm looking at. You may need to zoom into 100%, maybe 50%, maybe the full fit in view, depending on the filter and what the effect you want to see. So in this case, you have different adjustments for each of these filters. There's really no correct setting for this. I'm just running through and taking a look. So I'll say these settings are going to work. Click OK. Now the filter is being applied to this top layer, and it's showing at 100% opacity, so the bottom layer is not visible at all. Now if I start changing my blend modes, the bottom layer starts to show through. And depending on which blend mode, it may show through more or less. And we're still getting the different tone and color blending because the two layers are still fairly similar, particularly in tonality and color, not necessarily in detail. But occasionally we get some interesting effects. And I kind of like what the texture is doing here on Lighten blend mode, showing through these bits and pieces. And screen gets a little bit more of an even look. So maybe I decide screen is a nice starting point. Then I can tweak the opacity to decide how much of this filtered layer is going to be visible. And I like what it does to get this um, sort of a dried mud pattern almost. Now let's say I decide I want this pattern to be bigger. I can double click on Filter Gallery again, and I'm just going to increase the cell size, something like that, and see how it looks. And that updates automatically. So I like what that does. Tweak the opacity a bit more, let those show through. And then I can also add an adjustment layer. Now this adjustment layer is currently being applied to the whole layer stack. I only want it to apply to this top layer, not the bottom one. So to do that, I have to click this clipping option button. So now it is clipping just to the filtered layer. And that's an interesting effect. It's one of these cases where you just really have to play with settings and see what all the different tricks are that you can achieve. And I start to wonder what happens if I invert the top image. Well, that's kind of interesting, but not exactly. I don't quite know what I want yet, so I'm just going to see where the road takes me. I'll let that reload. Okay. That high contrast look isn't terribly bad there. I think I'll keep that. Close down that palette so I can see what I'm doing. So now I've got a stack of layers. Everything is the two image layers are smart objects. I've got a smart filter applied to the top one and an adjustment layer applied to the top one as well. So double clicking on any of these will allow me to go in and tweak their settings, whatever the settings may be. If it's filter settings, adjustment layer settings, double click on that, or adjusting the image in camera raw. So perhaps I want to apply soft clarity on this and see what happens. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. So that certainly applies more of a dreamy look to the photo. And then I can retweak my visibility settings. Let's see here. Okay, so I ran into something else with Photoshop. Double-clicking on this layer here also edited the one on the bottom. Try that again. Reclip that. And make a smart object out of that bottom layer, so that should separate now. Let me try editing my clarity setting again and see what happens. Okay, that should have done it there. Well, that was a little annoying, but I think we figured that out. Alright, so now I'm ready to save this. File, Save As. My habit when working with multiple layers like this is to save it as a Photoshop file. A TIFF will retain the layers as well, but in my head, I generally associate a PSD as being a layered file. So I'll choose Photoshop, PSD, make sure that layers stays checked, and the color profile will be fine there. Save that. I'll choose Maximize Compatibility. And because I want to make sure that's always going to be the case, I'm just going to say Don't Show Again and click OK. Now the file is saving, and it should appear in Lightroom. And here it is in the top of the stack. Take a look at that under Loop View, and there is the filtered image. I'll go back to Photoshop. I'm going to close that to show one other caveat. Now normally to start with I do edit in smart object. If I do that for this layered image, it will open up as a new smart object without any of the layers. So I don't want that to happen. I'm going to close that and not save it. Back to Lightroom. What I want to do in this case, when I know it's a layered file and I want to go back and work on the layers, I'll do edit in Adobe Photoshop, just the straight edit in command, and edit original, and that will bring up all the layers. So now I can readjust this and resave it normally. So that's something to watch out for. So that is a look at getting files into Photoshop, working with them as smart objects, and working with layers and various layer effects and blending modes.